I've got a story for you. It's called The Lady of Carlisle. This happened a long time ago in a place called Carlisle, where they had wild lions. Tigers, as you know, stick to themselves, but these lions lived together in bunches and terrorized the country. There was a lady living in Carlisle without a bit of family who had been filled with strange ideas by her long-dead mamma. She was very beautiful and courted by all the bachelors in the district, who reckoned her a great prize on account of her looks and her money. However, her mamma had taught her that to be beautiful was to be special, and therefore she shouldn't throw herself away on the first or even the second young man who came along. She should wait instead for a man of good family, wealth, honor, and courage. Test 'em, her mamma said. Now, since her papa had made a fortune selling stale breadcrumbs, he had left her enough money that she could afford to sit year after year waiting for her regular Sunday afternoons and her suitors to come calling. She always disqualified them, however, if not on one ground, then on another. She spent a good many years this way, sitting in her parlor, getting older and odder, and having great fun turning down suitors on Sunday afternoons. In time, there wasn't a single eligible man in 40 miles that she hadn't said no to at least once. In fact, it finally got so that when a stranger was in town on a Sunday afternoon, the local fellows would send him out to be turned down. The town was small, and this provided them with at least one consistent amusement. Finally, however, it happened that on one particular Sunday there were two young men drinking in town. One was a lieutenant, with plumed hat and a fancy coat with several shiny medals. The other was a sea captain who had sailed around the world no less than 3 times, for all that he was young. Both were of quite unexceptionable families, were more than full in the pocket, were men of honor and had medals or other testimony to their courage, and both were single. They were, in point of fact, by a good margin, the two likeliest candidates that had ever been seen in Carlisle. The local fellows didn't even try to choose between them. They simply laid the situation straight out, and both young men had drunk enough to find the idea appealing, as well as a quite sensible method of settling the age-old rivalry between the army and the navy. So off they went to pay court. They found the lady at home and quite disposed to receive them. In fact, it put her in quite a flutter, and she turned out to be, even after all these years, as fine-looking a woman as either of these well-traveled young men had ever seen. She, on her side, found them both to be exactly the sort of men that her mother had told her to watch and wait for she quizzed them quite closely. That they had both shown up on the very same day, however, gave her quite a problem to resolve, and she finally determined to settle it by her mamma's method. "I will set you both a test," she said, "and the man that passes it will be the man I wed." She had a pair of horses and a carriage brought around, and they all climbed in. The young bloods who had sent them in were all waiting in the yard, and they followed the carriage down the road, sporting and making bets. The carriage went over the hill and down the road, and in time it came to the den of those lions that had been offending the local people. And there the fair young lady brought the horses to a stop. She'd no sooner done that than she fell rigid to the ground. They picked her up and dusted her off, but she didn't say a word to anybody for upwards of a quarter hour. The two young fellows asked the local boys about that, and they were told that it was the sort of thing she was likely to do from time to time. When the lady came to her senses again, after a manner of speaking, she threw her fan down in the den of lions. Well, that stirred them up, as you can imagine, and they began growling and prowling around. Then, quite satisfied with herself, the young lady said, "Now, which of you gentlemen will win my hand by returning my fan to me?" That really got the local boys to laying bets. The two young men looked down at the lion's den and then at her, back and forth, mulling the situation over and trying to come to a good fair decision. Finally, the lieutenant, who deserved every one of the medals he wore, but who'd been taught a thing or two about good sense by his own mamma, shook his head and said he thought he'd go back to town and have another pint of beer. He walked off down the road, muttering under his breath about women and their silly notions. Then everybody looked at the sea captain, wondering what he would do. Finally, he took off his coat so that it wouldn't get mussed, straightened his collar so that he would look his best in spite of not being dressed properly, and said, "I'll do it." And he climbed down to the entrance to the lion's den. There were some who said that he had more courage than brains, and there were some who said he'd just had too much to drink. In any case, he disappeared inside the den, and there wasn't anybody who thought he'd ever come back out again. They strained to see, but it was dark inside the den. They could hear the lions grumbling among themselves. And then the sea captain emerged, looking slightly rumpled, with the fan in his hand. Well, when the lady saw him coming, she said, "Here I am," and prepared to throw herself into his arms. The sea captain just looked her in the eye and said, "If you want your fan, you can get it yourself," and threw it back to the lions. Then he walked back to town and stood the lieutenant the price of a beer, after which each of them went his own way. I don't know if the lady ever got her fan back. The end. And now, a poetic version of the same story. And then after that, I'll tell you where they both come from. Let my inspiration flow in token rhyme, suggesting rhythm that will not forsake me till my tale is told and done. While the fire lights aglow, strange shadows from the flames will grow, till things we've never seen will seem familiar. Shadows of a sailor forming, winds both fair and foul all sworn. Down in Carlisle, he loved a lady many years ago. Here beside him stands a man, a soldier, by the looks of him, who came through many fights, but lost at love. While the storyteller speaks, a door within the fire creaks, suddenly flies open, and a girl is standing there. Eyes alight with glowing hair, all that fancy paints as fair. She takes her fan and throws it in the lion's den. Which of you to gain me, tell, will risk uncertain pains of hell? I will not forgive you if you will not take the chance. The sailor gave at least a try, the soldier being much too wise. Strategy was his strength, and not disaster. The sailor coming out again, the lady fairly leapt at him. That's how it stands today. You decide if he was wise. The storyteller makes no choice. Soon you will not hear his voice. His job is to shed light and not to master. Since the end is never told, we pay the teller off in gold in hopes he will come back. But he cannot be bought or sold. Okay, so interesting literary history. The poetic version, called Lady with a Fan, is by Robert Hunter, who was one of the primary lyricists for the Grateful Dead. And this poem was incorporated into their extended musical composition, the Terrapin Suite, also known as Terrapin Station, which is an extraordinary piece of modern music. And where did Robert Hunter get this story from? Well, he probably first encountered it in the version I read earlier, the prose story. That story appears randomly in the middle of a science fiction book published in 1968, Rite of Passage, written by Alexei Panshin. Now, both Robert Hunter and Jerry Garcia were dedicated science fiction readers, so Rite of Passage being a fairly prominent sci-fi book in 1968, I bet Robert Hunter read it and encountered the story there. Then he may have gone looking for its origins. It does seem unusual. It sort of sticks out like a sore thumb in the larger arc of that science fiction story, this folk tale. And doubtless Robert Hunter then found these old ballads from the 19th century, such as Lady of Carlisle and others, that tell this story. And those ballads are based on yet earlier ballads and poems as well by people like Schiller and others. And then those poems and ballads and songs and stories date all the way back to an incident which might have, in fact, really happened. And this would be about 1750 when the king of France was admiring his lions. He had lions in an enclosure. And according to the original story, a lady who was there with her suitor, who had long been trying to persuade her to marry him, she took her glove, not her fan, and threw it amongst the lions and said, "If you love me as much as you say and want me so bad, go and fetch my glove." And he did. He went and got the glove, and he then stepped gingerly around the lions. And, lions in captivity who are well fed, they're not going to attack. He probably knew that. Rather unlikely, but he appeared extremely brave to all the onlookers. Anyway, he came out of the enclosure, and then the lady was really impressed, but he threw the glove back to her, threw it in her face, as it were, and said, "No, you asked me to do that to prove my love. I'm no longer interested." And supposedly she entreated him many times after that, and he ignored her and never happened. So that's the story. I meant their relationship never happened, but the story supposedly is true. and inspired all these different versions, all these ballads and so on, all the way down to the present day. Most people don't know this story anymore, apart from Grateful Dead fans. But what's interesting is the version I read first from that book, Rite of Passage, that restores the element of the story which had been lost in some of the songs because some of the song versions, being romantic, made it so that at the end the lady, embraces the sailor and they're married and happily ever after. But the story from that 1968 book restores the original ending where the lady is rejected for her absurd test. So it's also possible Robert Hunter didn't read that version because his poetic rendering of the story doesn't include that ending, although it is sort of ambiguous. Anyway, so I hope you enjoyed this interesting journey through a few centuries of literary history, greatly summarized, of course, and I could have quoted many more of these ballads and so on. I'll put a link for people who want to read a bit more about it. And it's just fascinating how stories can be reinvented many times over many generations. And if the transmission is oral, people don't know how old they are or where they came from, other than these literary scholars who do the digging. Hope you found it interesting. Bye for now.